Good morning, and thank you for joining us for today's event, Investing in Innovation, a blueprint for enduring American semiconductor leadership. My name is Lindsay McPherson. I'm a senior reporter for fiscal policy and politics at CQ Roll Call. Before we begin today's event, I'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsor, the Semiconductor Industry Association, for their partnership with us to make this event possible. Today, we have some remarks from lawmakers who are backers of this bill. And before we do that, I want to explain to you guys a little bit about what this bill does. This is a competition bill that the House and Senate have been working on for the better part of this past year and even in the part of the Senate. The lead aspect of this bill is $54 billion in mandatory spending that will provide grants for semiconductor manufacturing and research here in the United States, as well as some deployment of 5G and other technologies and science provisions. There's also some tax credits and investment tax credit for semiconductor manufacturing that lawmakers say is a key pairing to go with the semiconductor grants. You'll hear more from the lawmakers about why these provisions are so important and why they're trying to get it passed ahead of the upcoming August recess. The Senate took a procedural vote this week to begin debate on a more narrow version of the bills that they passed last year that still contains the semiconductor manufacturing grants and tax credits. And next week, the Senate is expected to take final action and final passage to send the bill to the House, which will also potentially take it up next week, no later than the week after, according to their schedule. Next, we will go into these remarks. First up is Representative Matsui. The floor is yours.
Hello to everyone joining us virtually today for the SIA CQ Roll Call event on American semiconductor leadership. While I wish we could be together in person to discuss this critical issue, there are just a few things going on in Congress this week. For me, like many of you streaming this conference, it feels like we're closer than ever to securing a legislative package that will reignite American innovation in the semiconductor industry and reestablish leadership for generations to come. The work we've been doing in Congress over the last few weeks represents a culmination of many, many months of hard work. A little more than 2 years ago, I joined a bipartisan group in the House and Senate to introduce the Chips for America Act. This bill established a roadmap for reasserting American leadership in the strategically important semiconductor industry. Since then, two things have occurred. The CHIPS Act was signed into law as part of the 2021 defense bill, and the need to fund it has only grown more severe as the global semiconductor shortage has dragged on. While the current scarcity has captured the nation's attention, it's important to remember that this decline has been decades in the making. The United States share of the global semiconductor market has fallen from 37% in 1990 to just 12% today. The effects of this decline and ensuing shortage cannot be overstated. Factories have closed, workers have been laid off, and prices have gone up. And although this decline has harmed the economy and weakened national security, reestablishing a thriving domestic industry holds the potential to secure economic growth and make America safer. Bringing manufacturing and research capacity back to the United States will have positive benefits in the short, medium, and long term. As new fabs funded by the CHIPS Act come online, they hold the potential to anchor regional technology clusters, creating well-paying jobs and spreading out America's base of skilled workers. This, in turn, can provide a more secure and resilient supply chain for the mission-critical components our national security apparatus needs to succeed. Thankfully, we have a legislative vehicle for achieving these goals. Both the House-passed Competes Act and Senate-passed USICA included the full $52 billion we need to comprehensively implement the CHIPS Act. This bipartisan, bicameral support acknowledges that the funding is about more than any one specific technology or industry. It's about securing a fundamental building block of the 21st century economy. But there's more that we can do. While the grant funding in the CHIPS Act will serve as a shot in the arm, we also have an opportunity to sustain these investments over time through a targeted tax incentive, as was included in the original bipartisan bill I introduced. I'm glad to see the Senate is working toward a vote on both the CHIPS grant funding and the targeted tax incentive. Together, these tools can complement one another and provide more tailored support and a broader reach. While we've made important progress on both fronts, it's clear other countries aren't sitting idle. They're starting to offer their own incentives aimed at attracting capital investments, fabs, and jobs. The European CHIPS Act sets an audacious goal of reaching 20% of worldwide semiconductor production by 2030. In Asia, Korea and India offer 50% design credits, and Taiwan offers a 15% R&D credit. For a company evaluating potential sites for a new multi-billion-dollar fab or research facility, these global incentives provide a very real opportunity to maximize their investments. It should be no surprise, then, that many companies are taking their dollars and talent abroad. That's why I've been so focused on getting this package across the finish line as soon as possible. We simply cannot afford any more squabbling or political gamesmanship. Companies aren't waiting to make big decisions, and neither should Congress. Despite all of this, I'm hopeful. In March, I led a bipartisan, bicameral letter signed by 147 members of Congress calling for the CHIPS funding as soon as possible. We had progressives, conservatives, rural and urban members sign that letter. And I know we got the political will to get this done. So let's keep our eyes on the prize and stay united for this last big push. I want to thank SIA and CQ Roll Call for the invitation to speak with you today and look forward to working with you on this critical issue moving forward. Thank you and enjoy the rest of the event.
Thank you, Representative Matsui, for your remarks. Next, I will be speaking with Representative John Katko about this bill. Hi, I'm Lindsay McPherson. I am a senior fiscal reporter for CQ Roll Call, and joining me now is Congressman John Katko of New York. He's the ranking member of the House Homeland Security Committee and a known moderate in the House, works with the Problem Solvers Caucus and across the aisle to get big bills done for the American people. And today we're talking about one of the biggest bills this Congress, which is a competition bill that's been known by many names. So we won't go through all the names, but the big point of this bill is to provide some major incentives for semiconductor manufacturing in the United States. So we are trying to compete with our allies in Europe, as well as, our major economic competitor, China, on semiconductor production and other research and innovation. And so I wanted to talk to Congressman Katko here about some of the big aspects of the bill. So Congressman Katko, let's start with the biggest part of this bill. There's $54 billion in mandatory appropriations. The vast majority of that is for incentives, grants for semiconductor manufacturing here in the United States. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of these provisions and what it would mean if this bill is passed this summer as anticipated?
Well, sure. Listen, you mentioned the competitiveness aspect, but overlaying all this is a real danger if we don't act. If China decides to go into Taiwan tomorrow, we have a worldwide crisis because China will have an iron grip on the high-end chip market manufacturing in the world. And so we need, from a national security standpoint, to bring that manufacturing back home, at least a sufficient amount of it to be able to stave off any problem with China. Now, on top of that, why would we not want to bring this manufacturing home? $52 billion or $54 billion is a lot of money. But if you think about the amount of money these companies will be investing in the United States, it's stunning how much more it would be. I would argue it's 10, 15, maybe even 20 times more than even if you use all the chip manufacturing grant money out there. So this is a great investment to not only have a national security component to it, but also an economic development component that is hard to look away from. There's companies that are talking about investing and are investing more money in manufacturing projects all across the country than we've ever had in the history of our country. So this is a win-win situation for us. And I think that we've got to get it done. The time for talking is over. I keep saying we can't polish a brass while the fire bell's ringing. The fire bell's ringing. China's rattling its saber. We need to get this done and get it going now.
And one of the other big pieces of the bill I wanted to ask you about is there are tax credits in here, an investment tax credit for semiconductor manufacturing as well, that is meant to be paired with the grant incentives. But some of your House Republican colleagues do oppose this tax credit. Ways and Means Chairman Kevin Brady, has called it kind of an industry-specific approach where he'd rather take a bit broader business approach to providing such incentives. Why do you support the tax credits, and why do you think that this is an important pairing to those grants that we just talked about?
Well, you just mentioned it. It's an important pairing. It's a critical pairing, okay? Again, let's think about the money that's being spent by these manufacturers here and the money that they're willing to invest, right? And the grant, I've been told, because I spoke to a lot of these manufacturers, some of them are very interested in investing in New York State, which would be the largest single project in the history of New York State, let alone probably the country, but certainly in New York State. And New York State has done their part. New York State has come up to the table and provided the incentives because they realize how important it is. We've already got a tech hub going in New York State, upstate New York, that is transforming our economy. And for that, to have the income tax credit going along with the money in the CHIPS Act would be the 1-2 punch that is going to incentivize those companies to come to the United States as opposed to maybe Europe. Europe is licking their chops trying to get them to come, but we will get them to come here. We will get them to invest here if we provide those incentives. And I think, like I said, many, many times more dollars and investments would be coming from this. This isn't a corporate handout by any stretch of the imagination, in my opinion.
Okay, and just to wrap it all up, I mean, you talked a little bit about it in your previous answers, but there is a big push right now to get this bill done before the August recess for these companies who are making business decisions now. Can you talk about why this particular timing is important versus waiting till the end of the year when there would have been potentially a broader agreement on the conference committee package, because this is a little more narrow than the conference committee version? Why is it important to do this now?
I think the conference committee version, to me, got larded up with a lot of stuff in the House and got sent back over to the Senate. Let's not forget the historical progress of this. We had a great bill that came out of the Senate. It came over to the House and got loaded up with a bunch of peripheral items, and then was sent back out. And obviously, those items haven't taken root. So now is the time to act. And if we go past this session, it then bleeds into the fall, and then it could possibly bleed into after the elections. Then it might get lost in the sauce, and it's too late then. I think now is the time to act, because now is the time to get this marker down and done. And like I said, every day we wait is another day that China could act to our detriment, and the European Union or others in Europe could act to incentivize these companies to come there instead. So this really is a critical time. I think everyone's waiting. And I think if it doesn't go now, I'm very concerned about what's going to happen going forward.
Thank you, Congressman Katko, for your time.
Sure. Thank you very much. Let's get this done.
Thanks again to Representative Katko for speaking with us. Next, we have some remarks from John Newfer.
Thank you, Lindsay, and hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm John Newfer, President and CEO of the Semiconductor Industry Association, located here in Washington. We're pleased you've joined us for this very timely and important discussion about the future of the semiconductor industry in the United States. Semiconductors make modern electronics possible. They're essential for just about every sector of the economy and our national security. They make the world smarter, more productive and efficient, and better connected. And as the global chip shortage has reminded us, it's no fun when we don't have enough of them. Unfortunately, America's share of global chip production has shrunk substantially over the past 30 years, from 37% to 12%, because incentives offered by governments in other countries have made it more attractive to build chip manufacturing facilities, called fabs, overseas. And we slipped in the innovation game as well, partly because federal investments in semiconductor research have been flat for decades, while other countries have doubled down on their research investments. But help could be on the way. Leaders in Washington are closing in on legislation called the CHIPS Act and the FABS Act that would address these problems, boost US-based semiconductor manufacturing, design, and research, and greatly strengthen America's economy and national security. I'm thrilled to be joined by leaders from some of the world's top chip companies for a discussion about the importance of this foundational industry and the urgent need for US government action to help make America home to more semiconductor research, design, and manufacturing. We have a stellar panel here. Steve Frasso, Managing Director of Global Government Affairs at Global Foundries, Bruce Andrews, Corporate VP at Intel, Courtney Gedeldig, Corporate VP of Global Public Affairs at Micron Technology, Mark Lippard, Executive VP at Samsung Electronics, and Peter Cleveland, SVP of Global Government Affairs at TSMC. Thank you all for being here. Let's dive right in. Steve, I'll turn it to you first. Let's do some level setting. Why are chips in such high demand, and what does the future of chip demand look like going forward?
Thank you, John, and thanks to SIA and CQ Roll Call for holding this important roundtable. I'll get to both questions, but let me start with the simple answer. There's an insatiable demand for semiconductors. Semiconductors enable everything from cars to phones to coffee makers, as well as enabling the technology of the future. Semiconductors power our economy, our national security, and all of our critical infrastructure. That said, there's been an even more pressing demand for chips in this last few years, which was created by a convergence of a few very specific events. First, a massive increase in the use of chips in mobile devices, 5G wireless infrastructure, and the Internet of Things. The number of chips has skyrocketed in automobiles, particularly electric vehicles. Plus, more people are working from home, and during the height of the COVID pandemic, learning from home. Chips are the gateway to the most innovative features and improvements sought by consumers and businesses, such as longer battery life, more reliable wireless connections, or secure payments with your phone. Now, John, your second question, what does the future look like, is more instructive, and I'll give you my answer in two parts. First, the demand for chips will continue to grow faster than the global supply of chips. Products will become even smarter, more efficient, and better connected, all of which will require more chips. The conservative estimate projects the global demand for chip manufacturing capacity will increase 56% over the next 10 years. So where will all of that manufacturing capacity go? Specifically, what countries or regions will those new facilities be built in? Well, that all depends on how policymakers respond. The US has an opportunity right now to pass a critical piece of legislation to incentivize our industry to increase domestic manufacturing capacity. At Global Foundries, we are already partnering with our customers to add sustainable capacity. And if we, along with the rest of the industry, can partner with the US government, the rate and pace of capacity growth will be even greater. Back to you, John.
Hey, Steve, thanks for that. You mentioned something about chip shortages, and that's a nice segue for a question to Courtney. And the question is, what is industry doing to meet high demand amid this global chip shortage?
Thanks, John. So the industries run their fabs at 90 to 95% utilization, which is well above what we consider to be full utilization, and added a substantial amount of new fab capacity. And I think we had to shift our thinking in the kinds of production we were doing, and that doesn't happen overnight. So those adjustments are beginning to take hold. But the result is that overall chip sales and sales to the auto sector, which you hear about often, are at all-time highs. And you just heard from Global Foundries about how high the demand is and only getting higher, and you see it on the news and in the newspapers, and it's obviously a big part of the reason we're having the conversation today. But it is only going to take 10 years for the memory sector, which is what Micron does, to double. And by 2030, memory is going to be a $330 billion market. And the rapid growth is not just for memory, that's across all the semiconductor areas. So to help meet the growing demand, Micron announced in October of 2021, October last year, our intent to invest more than $150 billion globally over the next decade in leading edge memory manufacturing and R&D. And memory and storage are a enormously fast growing portion of the global semiconductor market, and today represent about 30% of all semiconductors. And with the growth in data and AI and 5G propelling that future demand, that investment is going to help place Micron in the best position to serve customers in the markets and further U.S. technology leadership. We would certainly like to do more of that in the U.S., and the legislation that is pending in Congress would be helpful in doing that. But the lack of a resilient domestic semiconductor supply chain represents far-reaching consequences in the economy beyond just the U.S. semiconductor industry and our competitiveness. And we recognize that there is an opportunity to really enhance the U.S. economy and our competitiveness, our technology leadership, and national security as part of a resilient supply chain.
Thanks, Courtney. Let's turn over to Bruce. Bruce, you work for a company that had something to do with the very beginnings of our industry, Intel. My question for you is, why are U.S. investments needed, and really, what happens if they're not forthcoming?
No, that's a really good question, John. As we like to say, we put the silicon in Silicon Valley. And, look, the U.S. has always been the leader in the global semiconductor industry. In 1990, the U.S. was 30% of the global share. Now we're down to just 12%, and investments in research are flat. And what we face is an increasingly competitive global marketplace. Other countries' governments are ramping up manufacturing incentives and R&D incentives. We see countries around the world competing aggressively to attract investment to their countries. And for U.S. companies to be successful, we can't operate at a 30 to 50% cost differential, which is what we see, in Asia and other countries. So the rest of the world is working hard to build their semiconductor industries, and the U.S. has to match as well. We have to have a level playing field so that new production and innovation occurs in the United States. And I'll tell you, we at Intel have announced $43.5 billion of investment in the United States, 20 billion of that in Arizona, 20 billion of that in Ohio, about $4.5 billion of that in New Mexico. We have very, very aggressive plans that we want to do here in the United States. But in order for those investments to be globally competitive, we have to have partnership with the U.S. government, because we're not just competing with companies, we're also competing with countries who have industrial policies that are very aggressive and that are, they give benefits there. And, from a not only economic security, but also recognizing that we live in a complicated geopolitical environment. So currently the industry is heavily concentrated in Asia, and we think that it's time to build out diversity, as Courtney pointed out, not just in the supply chain, but also in the manufacturing. And I think if we learned anything during, the COVID situation and the challenges that, free trade and consolidation is good for pricing, it creates grave risks that we need to avoid if there are disruptions to the global manufacturing chain. So every day that we wait is another day that the U.S. risks losing ground to our global competitors. And I will tell you, from an Intel standpoint, we've also announced investments in Germany. We are very excited and want to move forward rapidly with our Ohio investments. But if the U.S. government can't give certainty to investors, that makes the U.S. less competitive globally. So it really is time for Congress to get the CHIPS Act done.
Thanks, Bruce. Great answer. Peter, you work for TSMC in Taiwan. It reshaped the industry when it founded the foundry model as a contract manufacturer. My question for you is, Congress seems very close to providing various incentives and investments along the lines of what Bruce was raising. Can you briefly explain what those investments are and how they will boost semiconductor production and innovation in the U.S.? Thanks, Peter.
Sure, John, and thank you. TSMC thanks you for your outstanding leadership at SIA for the past few years vis-a-vis the CHIPS Act. This legislative jigsaw puzzle is something that we're going to solve. We're optimistic and hopeful about getting the CHIPS Act across the line soon. What's at stake? U.S. leadership in manufacturing is what is at stake. Ushering in a new digital innovation era led by the United States is what is at stake. And in order to do that, the CHIPS Act needs to be enacted into law. So a few comments about the CHIPS Act for the audience. The bill was introduced in June of 2020. It was authorized in law, but it needs to be appropriated. The $52 billion in funds now needs to be approved by Congress and signed by the president. Again, we're optimistic that can happen. We think lawmakers bipartisanly have supported this piece of legislation over the past couple of years, and now is the time to act. Inside of that $52 billion is $39 billion for new manufacturing across this country, for global foundries, for Intel, for fantastic companies like Micron. TSMC is investing in Phoenix. What's that translate into? That translates into high-tech, high-wage jobs, economic competitiveness, more exports, and leadership in chip manufacturing. That's the goal. There's also money in the CHIPS Act, John, for R&D. There will be an NSTC created, a Semiconductor Technology Center created. Chuck Schumer's done fantastic work there. There will be a new center for advanced packaging, a critical new area for the semiconductor business. As chips get more complex, we need more power, performance, energy efficiency, transistor density, and packaging is a crucial area. And then also in the CHIPS Act is something called an investment tax credit for 25%, which has a catalytic impact in terms of injecting funding into the U.S. ecosystem to accelerate manufacturing. The U.S. needs to lead, and the CHIPS Act is the key that unlocks that door. So we're very hopeful about this occurring soon, John. At the end of the day, what's the bill do? The two or three critical things: it'll lift the innovative capacity of this country, it'll accelerate economic competitiveness, and it'll ensure U.S. national security. And all the companies agree on that front, as do lawmakers, that that's a good idea.
Great, thank you much, Peter, for that answer. Let's turn to Mark. Samsung already has a substantial manufacturing footprint in the U.S. How will federal investments impact semiconductor production here, and what benefits would investments have on our economy, our jobs, and national security from your perspective, Mark? The floor is yours.
All right, thanks, John. It's always a risk to go late in the order after a bunch of really smart people, because they've made most of the points more eloquently than I can. I'll just be brief here and say 3 main points. First, as you and Bruce alluded to, it's no secret the U.S. Lacks a set of comprehensive, mutually reinforcing set of policies, incentives, and structures to attract and sustain the manufacturing and design of semiconductors. And it's in stark contrast to virtually every other place on Earth with an advanced semiconductor ecosystem. The gap is real, as you pointed out, and underscored through the data you brought to bear and Bruce brought to bear as well. And that is a critical employment, national security concern. The good news has been alluded to by Peter. There is strong bipartisan consensus in Washington to remedy this through CHIPS and FABS Acts. That's why we're here today, point 1. Point 2, the way we're doing this, or on the cusp of doing this, leverages some of the greatest strengths in terms of foreign policy, national security of the United States. Our friends, partners, allies around the world who manufacture the most advanced semiconductors and their associated technologies are brought into this process. Mixing friends and allies who possessed these capabilities, together with the drive and ingenuity of the American people and the policies, incentives, and structures of chips and fabs, is a powerful combination and a strong recipe for success across the sectors you mentioned in your question, John. Not just good business. In the US, it will bolster the supply chain, critical capabilities in advanced semiconductors, strengthen capacity for more mature technologies, and enhance R&D. Will create employment, prosperity, opportunity, and it will help maintain our technological edge, critical to American leadership in the world as we know it in the 21st century. Big reason the United States and the country in which Samsung is headquartered, Republic of Korea, are working closely together on this set of issues, which helps strengthen not just the alliance, but the international environment. Final point, at Samsung, we have long recognized the power of these synergies. It's why we became the first international company to make semiconductors in the US over a quarter century ago, based in no small measure on the support of these synergies across a bipartisan group in Congress and the Biden administration. We announced a $17 billion investment in the US to create leading edge manufacturing facility in Taylor, Texas, 2,000 high-paying jobs directly, tens of thousands of additional good-paying jobs, and support the training and talent development of local communities. That is a national security on a holistic, broadly defined basis. Let me close by saying, as others have made the point, it is self-evident that folks are at an inflection point on these decisions. Congress really needs to move now. Passing chips and fabs and ensuring the associated policies are balanced and effective will almost certainly impact these decisions and outcomes. We can't miss the opportunity. The benefits are real. The decision is at hand, and the implications are lasting. We look forward to working with this group and others in Washington to finish the job. Back to you, John. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark. Very well put. We have a little bit of time here, and I want to throw a couple of questions at the panel. Whoever wants to go after the question, feel free. So the chip industry is doing very well. We sold more units, over 1 trillion chips last year, setting a record than we ever have. And so sometimes I get the question, well, why does this industry need incentives to build fabs? What's the dynamic here if the companies are doing so well? Anyone want to jump in on that?
Sure, I'd be happy to take that one, John. Look, as I said before, this is a global competition. And so we can decide either we don't want to compete as a country, or if we want to compete, then we have to take actions. And the bottom line is we really need to decide whether we want to have manufacturing, advanced manufacturing, semiconductor manufacturing in the United States or not. In order to do that, we have to be globally competitive because the rest of the world has set the rules, and we can either decide we want to compete or we can just choose not to. But if we want to, and if we particularly, providing for security for the United States in the future, the US government has to partner with the industry in order to do this. Otherwise, companies will just locate this manufacturing in other countries. And the US will go from the 12% that we are today down to 0. And none of us want to see that happen.
Anyone else want to jump at that? I've got another. Peter, you look like you're.
I think I'd add a footnote or two, John. I think extremely important for the United States to be able to fabricate on the bleeding edge. Secretary Raimondo has talked about that capability not being here, and companies like TSMC are prepared to help to solve that problem in the context of an explosion of applications in the AI space. It might be digital healthcare, autonomous vehicles, VR, AR. You need advanced computing power. And so it's really a quality over quantity issue. It's exceedingly expensive to construct wafer fabs at 5 nanometers and below. And that's why partnership and collaboration with the US government is crucial to ensure that the United States has this capability here onshore versus it being offshore.
Thanks, Peter. Steve, I think I've got another one to you that's related to that. We've heard from a number of panelists that leading edge production is very important. But there's also a lot of folks in sectors such as automotive and medical devices that say we need to have mature node as well. Do you want to offer a perspective on that?
Sure, John, and thanks. That's a fantastic question. And, that other perspective is 100% correct. I think I alluded to it in my comments. You originally asked me, why is there such a growing demand? And I think you have to look at where is that demand coming from, right? And one of the largest growing sectors is the automobile space, right? So a typical new car will have, approximately 100 semiconductors, which is significantly more than it ever had. But now if you look at a new EV, you're looking at maybe over 3,000 semiconductors, and that's just for one vehicle. When you really look at what has gotten so much attention recently, it's been the automobile industry's inability to ship vehicles because they can't get enough semiconductors. So I think that as this legislation rightfully does, is it allows for investment in all of the different nodes, bleeding edge, but also some of the legacy technology. And I think we can all agree that's extremely important.
Thanks for that, Courtney. This quick question is for you. I hear it costs a lot to build a fab, and particularly in logic, but also memory. I've heard that there could be lots of private sector investment coming in with the chips. Chips is acting as kind of seed money. Do you want to offer any perspectives on that?
You're absolutely right about the cost. Building what we call a mega fab, the large manufacturing facilities that we're talking about. And in memory, they do take up a lot of space, we have a lot of scale. They can cover more than 1 million square feet and make up multiple facilities, likely cost us between $40 and $50 billion. And that's really why both the CHIPS funding and the investment tax credit, which has been introduced in the House and the Senate in the FABs legislation, are so important because they are the things that allow us to continue to invest in these facilities over time, which are very cost intensive. And this is an extremely cost intensive industry that puts out more in CapEx than potentially any other industry. Doing that requires the cost competitive delivery of our large scale memory manufacturing, and it just can't happen. I think to Bruce's point earlier about what other governments are doing, that just can't happen without sustained government support, which is why that investment tax credit piece is so important. I think you're absolutely right that we would hope it attracts all kinds of other types of investment into the industry. And I think it's really critical to kind of keep our eye on why we need to be doing this in the US, and diversifying the supply chain is a big part of it. But we do rely heavily on foreign nations' manufacturing capabilities, and Stephen's right about the need for us to continue to support the trailing edge, but and the legacy nodes. I just want to make one point on memory. Only 2% of global memory is manufactured in the US right now, all of which is produced by Micron at our facility in Virginia. And all of that goes to legacy, all but a small amount goes to legacy, so autos and industrial and defense. But the US does not currently produce any leading edge memory. So the really critical thing for us is to be able to start producing that leading edge DRAM in the US and be able to bring that part of the supply chain onto onshore to the United States. And this is if Congress is able to bring those competitive incentives and partnerships over the finish line, Micron and other companies will be able to do that.
Thanks so much, Courtney. Mark, quick question, and we're going to have to wrap up really quickly here. You've been in and out of government, and you've watched Washington, and it's had for decades a knee-jerk negative response to industrial policy. Yet, Congress looks poised to move forward with chips and fabs. Some say it's very closely linked to that semiconductors are very important to national security. Any perspectives on that?
John, I think it's pretty clear that we are in a new geopolitical age. The dynamics have shifted dramatically over the last 5 to 10 years. And what we have seen is that you need to be strong at home to be strong abroad. And this is a vital part of national security. And I think that's exactly what U.S. policymakers have identified. And this strength at home concept, I think, has got real traction and real teeth. And I think that's precisely why we're here today talking about the need to pass these important pieces of legislation to move us forward in that dimension. Thanks, John. Back to you.
Fantastic. Okay, we've got a couple of minutes. We're going to do a lightning round here. If you have 30 seconds in the elevator with a key Washington policy maker, what would be your bottom line message to that person about the need to get swift government action to strengthen the U.S. industrial base when it comes to chip manufacturing, design, and research? Let's start with Steve.
Thanks, John. This isn't about one company or even one industry. It's about America. It's about American competitiveness, economic vitality, innovation, and national security. This legislation has been discussed, debated, and analyzed for 2+ years. It's time that Congress takes action and passes CHIPS legislation.
Thanks, Steve. Peter.
Thanks, John. U.S. leadership of chip manufacturing matters. It matters an extraordinary amount. We're not a follower nation. We're a leadership nation. And it's time to pass the CHIPS Act to ensure the national security and the economic security of this country.
Great. Courtney.
So the entire semiconductor industry is making decisions right now on where this new capacity is going to be built. We want to avoid another chip shortage. We want to invest in our national security, our technology leadership, our economic competitiveness, and meet the rising demand of the markets. So the question is not where or whether we're going to make these multi-billion-dollar investments, it's where we're going to make them. And we know that it's important that we make them in the US. So now is really the time for Congress to invest in the future of the country and fund the CHIPS Act and the investment tax credit. It's never been more critical.
Thanks, Courtney. Bruce.
Sure. Hey, look, we're at an inflection point in history. We have two courses. We can either choose to be a country that manufactures advanced semiconductors, or we can choose to let them go everywhere else in the world and to be reliant on other regions and other countries. And I think the answer is pretty clear, and I think there's a consensus. But if there is a consensus, then we need to act now because investment is taking place, decisions are being made, and so we need to act quickly, and Congress needs to get this done and move it over the finish line.
Thanks, Bruce. Mark.
I was never good at elevator pitches when I was in government, so maybe with age, I've gotten better. So it's the right thing. Right thing for national security, right thing for the economy, right thing for the American worker, right thing for the U.S. taxpayer. Very few issues that are so central to our prosperity, technological advantages, our commercial viability, while having these foreign policy and geopolitical implications with not just with the United States and our but also our allies around the world. Range of leaders from all parts of the political, business, and NGO spectrum support this. We're on the cusp of doing something historic, really important to do.
Thanks, Mark. I'll buy all of that. Fantastic answers. You guys sound like you've spent some time in Washington. We're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time. A big thanks to our panelists for providing their great insights today. It's clear America has an historic, possibly fleeting opportunity to invest in its semiconductor future and reinforce the U.S. economy and national security in one fell swoop. These investments have the support of bipartisan majorities in Washington, which is rare these days, America's governors, national security experts, business leaders, and 2/3 of America's voters from across the political spectrum. It really is time for Congress to get this legislation across the finish line before our window of opportunity slams shut. Thank you, everyone, and thanks again for this really great panel. Back to you, Lindsay.
That wraps up today's event. Thank you to our speakers for joining us for this important and timely discussion, and to the Semiconductor Industry Association for making today's dialogue possible. If you missed any portion of today's program, it will be on rollcall.com and on Roll Call's YouTube and Facebook pages. Enjoy the rest of your day.